My name is Madeline Carter, and for 12 years, I believed loyalty meant something in the corporate world. I believed that dedication, expertise, and quiet competence would eventually be recognized. I believed that if you worked hard enough, stayed late enough, and sacrificed enough of your personal life, you'd earn your place at the table. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was never wrong about one thing. I knew exactly how every system at Axion Dynamics worked, because I built most of them myself. It's funny how you can spend over a decade of your life somewhere and still feel invisible. Every morning at 7:15 sharp, I'd badge into the gleaming glass tower that housed Axion Dynamics, riding the elevator to the 15th floor where our operations department hummed with the quiet efficiency I'd helped orchestrate. The building itself was a monument to modern corporate success. All clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of downtown Portland's skyline. But for all its architectural grandeur, it was the invisible infrastructure that kept the place running. The networks and databases and automated systems that most people took for granted until something went wrong. And things went wrong more often than anyone wanted to admit. I'd grown up in Bend, a small town in Central Oregon where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a handshake still meant something, and where hard work was respected regardless of how quietly it was performed. Maybe that's why I never learned to play the corporate game the way I should have. In Bend, if you fixed someone's tractor, they remembered. If you helped harvest their wheat when they were short-handed, they returned the favor when you needed it. The currency was competence and character, not charisma and connections. Corporate America, I learned too late, operates on an entirely different economy. When I first joined Axion Dynamics straight out of Oregon State with my computer systems engineering degree, the company was a scrappy startup with big dreams and limited resources. I was employee number 47, hired as a junior systems analyst with the kind of enthusiasm that only comes from believing you're going to help build something meaningful. The founder, Marcus Hayward, was still working out of a cramped office suite, and everyone wore multiple hats because we had to. I wasn't just analyzing systems. I was designing them, implementing them, troubleshooting them at 2 a.m. when everything crashed during a critical update. Those early years were intoxicating. Every problem was a puzzle to solve. Every system integration was a chance to prove what I could do. I missed my 25th birthday party because we were migrating our entire customer database to a new platform. And I was the only one who understood both the legacy system and the new architecture well enough to ensure nothing got lost in translation. I missed my sister Jenny's engagement celebration because our payment processing system went down on Black Friday, and I spent 18 hours straight rebuilding it from backup servers. I told myself these sacrifices mattered. I told myself I was building something important. By year 3, Axion had grown from startup to mid-sized company, and by year 5, we were being courted by major investors. The scrappy office suite became a full floor, then 3 floors, then the entire building. Marcus brought in professional management, people with MBAs from prestigious schools and experience at Fortune 500 companies. The culture began to shift from whatever it takes to get the job done to whatever it takes to manage up effectively. That's when I should have seen the writing on the wall. But I was too busy keeping the lights on. As the company grew, so did the complexity of our systems. We had customer relationship management databases, inventory tracking systems, financial reporting platforms, automated billing processes, and a dozen other interconnected systems that had to talk to each other seamlessly, or the whole operation would grind to a halt. Most of these systems were custom-built solutions I'd developed during the early years, patched and upgraded and modified countless times to meet evolving business needs. The thing about custom systems is that they're only as good as the person who understands them. And increasingly, I was the only person who truly understood how all the pieces fit together. My official title was Senior Administrative Coordinator, a bureaucratic designation that gave no hint of what I actually did. On paper, I coordinated meetings, managed schedules, and facilitated communication between departments. In reality, I was the invisible architect of Axion's entire digital infrastructure. When the accounting system crashed during quarterly reporting, I was the one who got it running again. When our customer portal started rejecting legitimate login credentials, I was the one who identified and fixed the authentication bug. When new regulations required changes to our data retention policies, I was the one who modified 17 different databases to ensure compliance. But none of this was reflected in my job description, my performance reviews, or my salary. Officially, I was administrative support. Unofficially, I was the person who made sure Axion Dynamics didn't collapse under the weight of its own technological complexity. I should have pushed for recognition earlier. I should have demanded a title that reflected my actual responsibilities. I should have insisted on being included in strategic planning meetings where technology decisions were made. But I was raised to believe that good work speaks for itself, that competence eventually gets rewarded, that the people in charge are smart enough to recognize value even when it doesn't come with a marketing campaign attached. I was raised to believe in fairness. And fairness, it turns out, is a luxury most corporations can't afford. The first warning sign came during my 10th year at Axion, when Charles Whitmore was brought in as Vice President of Operations. Charles had the kind of resume that looked impressive in board presentations. Harvard MBA, 15 years at McKinsey, previous experience optimizing operational efficiency at 3 different companies. What he didn't have was any understanding of how Axion systems actually worked. But that didn't stop him from making immediate changes to streamline processes and eliminate redundancies. His first initiative was to audit all departmental functions to identify areas where responsibilities overlapped. I spent weeks documenting every task I performed, every system I maintained, every process I developed over the years. The resulting report was 47 pages long and included detailed flowcharts showing how various systems interfaced with each other. I thought surely this would demonstrate the scope and importance of my role. Instead, Charles's response was to suggest that my responsibilities be distributed among team members to ensure knowledge sharing and reduce single points of failure. I tried to explain that most of these systems required specialized knowledge that couldn't be easily transferred. I pointed out that I'd built many of them from scratch and that their documentation, while comprehensive, couldn't substitute for deep hands-on experience. I offered to train other team members, but emphasized that it would take months or even years for someone else to achieve the same level of expertise. Charles listened politely and then informed me that he'd already identified someone who could help shoulder my workload. Tracy Bennett, a new hire who would be joining as Administrative Operations Specialist. I should have been suspicious when Tracy started 3 weeks later with a salary $15,000 higher than mine and a job title that sounded more impressive despite having less actual responsibility. I should have been concerned when she was given access to systems that took me years to earn permission to modify. I should have recognized the signs of corporate maneuvering when she began attending meetings I'd been excluded from, despite having been with the company for less than a month. But I was too busy training her. Tracy was pleasant enough, at least at first. She was 28 years old, with an MBA from Northwestern and previous experience at 2 consulting firms. She asked good questions during our training sessions and seemed genuinely interested in understanding how Axion's systems worked. She was also extremely good at the political aspects of corporate life that I'd never mastered, remembering personal details about executives' families, volunteering for high-visibility projects, and making sure her contributions were noticed and acknowledged in public forums. Within 6 months, Tracy had become Charles's go-to person for operational questions. Within a year, she was representing our department in strategic planning meetings while I continued to handle the actual technical work. It was an arrangement that should have been obviously unsustainable. But corporate hierarchies often prioritize perception over reality, and Tracy was much better at managing perceptions than I was. The breaking point came during our annual system security audit. Every year, external consultants reviewed our data protection protocols and tested our various security measures. It was always a stressful time because any vulnerabilities they discovered had to be addressed immediately, often requiring complex modifications to multiple interconnected systems. This particular year, the auditors identified a potential vulnerability in our customer data access logs. It wasn't a critical security flaw, but it did represent a gap in our monitoring capabilities that could theoretically be exploited by someone with administrative access. The fix required updating authentication protocols across 7 different databases and modifying the user permission structure for our customer management system. I'd handled similar updates many times before, but this one was particularly complex because it involved systems that had been built at different times using different programming languages. The customer management system was built on an older platform that I'd developed during Axion's startup days. While some of the databases had been upgraded to newer architectures over the years, making them all work together seamlessly required understanding not just how they currently functioned, but how they'd evolved over time. I spent 3 weeks developing a comprehensive update plan that would address the security concerns without disrupting normal business operations. The plan included detailed timelines, fallback procedures, and testing protocols to ensure everything worked correctly before going live. I scheduled the updates for a weekend when system usage would be minimal, and I arranged for additional IT support to be on standby in case anything went wrong. Everything should have proceeded smoothly. I'd done similar updates dozens of times before, and I'd learned from experience how to anticipate and prepare for potential complications. But this time, there was a complication I hadn't anticipated. Tracy had convinced Charles that she should oversee the security update process. Her reasoning was that overseeing major system changes fell within her administrative operations responsibilities, and that she needed to gain more hands-on experience with our technical infrastructure. Charles agreed, apparently viewing this as a good opportunity for Tracy to expand her skill set and take on additional leadership responsibilities. I tried to explain that system security updates weren't the kind of work you learned through observation. These updates required understanding the underlying code structure, knowing how different systems communicated with each other, and being able to troubleshoot problems in real time when things didn't go according to plan. But Charles had already made his decision, and my objections were dismissed as resistance to knowledge sharing and collaborative leadership. 1. The weekend of the update. Tracy arrived at the office with a notebook full of questions and a confidence level that far exceeded her actual expertise. She'd apparently spent the previous week reading through system documentation and talking to other IT staff, and she seemed to believe this crash course had prepared her to manage a complex security update. I walked her through the update process step by step, explaining each command before executing it and showing her how to monitor system responses to ensure everything was working correctly. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. The authentication protocol updates were implemented without problems, and the database modifications were proceeding according to schedule. Then Tracy decided to optimize the process. While I was updating the final database in the sequence, she noticed that the customer management system was showing some lag in response times. This wasn't unusual during major updates, but Tracy interpreted it as a sign that something was wrong. Without consulting me, she initiated what she called a performance optimization routine that she'd found in the system documentation. What she'd actually found was a legacy maintenance script that I'd written years earlier for an entirely different purpose. The script was designed to defragment database indexes during periods of low activity, but it hadn't been used in over 2 years because we'd upgraded to systems that handled optimization automatically. More importantly, running this script during an active security update was like performing engine maintenance while driving on the highway. I realized what was happening when I saw error messages starting to cascade across my monitor. The customer management system was trying to execute Tracy's optimization routine at the same time it was processing my authentication updates. And the conflicting operations were creating data conflicts that threatened to corrupt the entire database. I immediately aborted both processes and began emergency procedures to restore the system from backup files. But the damage was already done. The interrupted update had left the authentication protocols in a partially implemented state, which meant that users couldn't access the customer management system at all. Worse, the optimization routine had begun modifying database indexes that were now inconsistent with the partially updated authentication structure. It took me 14 hours to untangle the mess and restore full system functionality. 14 hours of careful, methodical work to reverse the damage and implement the security updates correctly. 14 hours during which Axion's customer service team couldn't access client information. Our sales team couldn't process new orders, and our billing department couldn't generate invoices. When Charles came in Monday morning, Tracy presented him with a report that characterized the weekend's events as a successful learning experience that had identified areas where our update procedures could be improved. She noted that while there had been some unexpected complications, the team had worked together effectively to resolve them and implement the necessary security improvements. My own report, which detailed exactly what had gone wrong and why, was received less enthusiastically. Charles seemed more concerned with assigning blame than understanding what had actually happened. In his view, the problems had occurred because I hadn't properly prepared Tracy to handle the oversight responsibilities he'd assigned to her. If I'd done a better job of knowledge transfer, the weekend's complications could have been avoided. I tried to explain that the complications had been caused by Tracy's unauthorized actions, not by inadequate preparation. I pointed out that I'd specifically warned against making any changes to the update process without consultation, and that the problems had occurred precisely because those warnings had been ignored. But Charles had already made up his mind. In his version of events, I was a territorial employee who was resistant to collaboration and unwilling to share knowledge effectively. Tracy, on the other hand, was a proactive leader who was working to modernize our operational procedures and eliminate single points of failure. Over the following months, I watched my role steadily diminish while Tracy's expanded. She was given access to systems that had previously been restricted to senior technical staff. She was included in planning meetings for major infrastructure upgrades that I'd previously managed independently. She was asked to provide input on technology decisions that she didn't have the background to evaluate properly. Meanwhile, I continued to handle the actual technical work. But with less autonomy and more oversight, every major decision had to be approved by Tracy, who would then present it to Charles as a collaborative recommendation. My direct communication with other departments was discouraged in favor of routing everything through Tracy's administrative operations framework. It was a slow-motion professional strangulation, and I felt powerless to stop it. The end came on a Tuesday morning in March. I'd just finished upgrading our email server security protocols, a routine maintenance task that I'd performed dozens of times before. The upgrade had gone smoothly, with no downtime and no user complaints. I was documenting the changes for our security compliance records when I received a calendar invitation for a meeting at 11 o'clock. The meeting was in Conference Room B, which was typically used for sensitive discussions. The attendees listed were Charles, Miranda Fox from Human Resources, and myself. No agenda was provided, but I didn't need one to understand what was coming. I'd been through enough corporate restructurings to recognize the signs: the private meeting with HR, the lack of advance notice, the location in a conference room rather than Charles's office, where interruptions were less likely. Someone was getting fired, and given the recent pattern of events, I had a pretty good idea who. I arrived at the conference room 5 minutes early, as was my habit, and found Charles and Miranda already seated at the polished wooden table. They had folders in front of them and the kind of serious expressions that people wear when they're about to deliver bad news they've already rehearsed. Charles began with the corporate equivalent of small talk, asking about my weekend and commenting on the weather. Miranda nodded along, occasionally glancing at her folder but saying nothing. I sat quietly and waited for them to get to the point. When Charles finally transitioned to the actual purpose of the meeting, he used language that I'm sure had been carefully crafted by the legal department. Axion Dynamics was undergoing a strategic restructuring of its operational framework. The company was committed to eliminating redundancies and optimizing resource allocation to ensure continued growth and competitiveness. As part of this restructuring, they'd identified several positions where responsibilities overlapped and could be consolidated more efficiently. My position was one of those being eliminated. The decision, Charles emphasized, was purely operational and had nothing to do with my performance or value to the company. In fact, they were grateful for my years of dedicated service, and they wanted to ensure a smooth transition that would preserve the institutional knowledge I developed over my tenure at Axion. Miranda took over to explain the details of my severance package. I would receive 12 weeks of salary, continued health insurance coverage for 6 months, and assistance with job placement services if I wanted it. In exchange, I would need to sign a separation agreement that included standard non-disclosure and non-compete clauses. I would also need to work with Tracy over the next week to ensure complete handover of my responsibilities. They wanted to make sure that all systems documentation was up to date and that Tracy had access to everything she'd need to maintain continuity of operations. I listened to all of this without saying much. What was there to say? I could have pointed out that Tracy didn't have the technical background to handle most of my responsibilities. I could have explained that many of our systems were too complex to transfer effectively in a week. I could have warned them that they were creating exactly the kind of single point of failure that Charles had claimed to be concerned about. But I'd learned enough about corporate politics to know that these decisions weren't really about operational efficiency or risk management. They were about power and perception and cost control. Tracy was younger, cheaper, and better at managing up. I was older, more expensive, and too focused on actual work to excel at the political aspects of corporate life. So instead of arguing, I asked practical questions. When would my last day be? How should I handle ongoing projects? What was the timeline for transferring system access credentials? I took notes and nodded at appropriate intervals and played the role of the professional, cooperative employee who understood that these things sometimes happen in the business world. The meeting ended with handshakes and expressions of mutual respect. Charles assured me that I'd always have a positive reference from Axion. And Miranda reminded me that the job placement services were available whenever I was ready to use them. They both seemed relieved that I'd taken the news so well. I spent the rest of that day in a strange, detached state, going through the motions of normal work while processing the reality of what had just happened. Colleagues who'd heard about the meeting stopped by my desk to offer sympathy or ask what was happening. But I found it difficult to explain the situation without sounding bitter or unprofessional. That evening, I sat in my small apartment in Southeast Portland, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that had been entirely consumed by work. My living room was furnished with items I'd bought online because I didn't have time to shop in stores. My kitchen contained mostly frozen meals and takeout containers because I rarely had time to cook. My social life consisted of occasional phone calls with family members and holiday cards from college friends whose lives had moved on while mine remained static. For 12 years, I'd defined myself primarily through my work at Axion. I was the person who kept the systems running, who solved the problems that no one else could solve, who sacrificed personal time to ensure that the company could function smoothly. Now, apparently, I was the person whose position was redundant, whose responsibilities could be transferred to someone else with a week of training. I opened a bottle of wine and tried to make sense of it all. The next morning, I began the process of transferring my responsibilities to Tracy. We started with system documentation, which I'd been updating continuously over the years, but which had never been designed to serve as a complete training manual. There's a difference between documenting how something works and explaining how to fix it when it breaks. And that difference becomes critical when you're trying to transfer complex knowledge quickly. Tracy approached the handover process with the same confidence she'd shown during the security update incident. She seemed to believe that understanding system architecture was primarily a matter of reading the right documents and asking the right questions. When I tried to explain the subtleties of how different systems interacted with each other, she took notes, but didn't seem to grasp the underlying principles that made those interactions possible. For example, our customer billing system interfaced with 3 different databases, each of which had been built on different platforms and used different data structures. Making changes to billing procedures required understanding not just how the billing system worked, but how those changes would propagate through the related databases and what secondary effects they might have on other systems. It was the kind of knowledge that came from years of experience working with these systems in production environments, not something that could be learned from documentation. But Tracy seemed confident that she could handle whatever challenges arose. She had her MBA training in process optimization, her experience with enterprise software at previous companies, and her access to Axion's IT support team if she needed technical assistance. From her perspective, system administration was largely a matter of following established procedures and escalating problems to appropriate specialists when necessary. I tried to warn her about the most common failure modes and the quickest ways to diagnose problems when they occurred. I walked her through several scenarios that had come up in the past. showing her how to identify symptoms and implement solutions. But there's a limit to how much practical knowledge can be transferred through hypothetical exercises. And I suspected that Tracy would need to learn some lessons through direct experience. On my last day, I cleaned out my desk and packed the few personal items I'd accumulated over 12 years into a cardboard box. A coffee mug my sister had given me. A small plant that had somehow survived years of inconsistent watering. A framed photo of my parents from their recent anniversary celebration, which I'd missed because of a system emergency that had required my attention over the weekend. Several colleagues stopped by to say goodbye, but the interactions felt awkward and forced. What do you say to someone who's been suddenly eliminated after more than a decade with the company? How do you acknowledge the professional relationship you've shared without getting into the politics of why they're leaving? Charles made a brief appearance to thank me again for my service and to express confidence that the transition would go smoothly. He mentioned that Tracy was excited about taking on expanded responsibilities and that he was sure she'd do an excellent job building on the foundation I'd established. I nodded and smiled and said the appropriate things about wishing everyone success in the future. But inside, I was thinking about all the things that could go wrong. All the problems that Tracy wouldn't know how to solve. All the interconnected systems that required understanding beyond what could be captured in documentation. I was also thinking about something else, something I hadn't mentioned during the handover process. Over the years, I'd built several security features into Axion systems that weren't documented in any manual. These were authentication protocols and access controls that I'd implemented quietly, during periods when I'd noticed suspicious activity or potential security vulnerabilities. Some of these features were designed to detect unauthorized access attempts and automatically lock down sensitive systems. Others were monitoring tools that tracked unusual patterns of data access and flagged them for review. A few were fail-safe mechanisms that would prevent critical systems from being modified without proper authorization codes. I'd implemented these security measures incrementally, usually in response to specific incidents or concerns. Each one was carefully designed to be invisible during normal operations, but to activate automatically if certain conditions were met. They were my insurance against the kinds of problems that could occur when people with administrative access didn't fully understand the systems they were modifying. These security features weren't documented because they weren't supposed to be visible to regular users. They were background processes that ran continuously, monitoring system activity and maintaining data integrity without interfering with normal operations. In most cases, people never knew they existed unless something triggered them. During the handover process, I'd considered mentioning these hidden security protocols to Tracy, but I'd decided against it for several reasons. First, explaining them would have required revealing that I'd implemented undocumented security measures without explicit authorization, which could have created legal complications for both me and the company. Second, the systems were designed to be self-maintaining, so Tracy shouldn't need to interact with them directly under normal circumstances. And third, I wasn't entirely sure that Tracy would understand how to work with these security features even if I did explain them to her. So I kept quiet about the hidden architecture that I'd built into Axion systems over the years. I told myself that these security measures would protect the company's data even if the new management didn't know they existed. I told myself that I was being professional by not complicating the transition with technical details that weren't immediately relevant. But I also knew that if something went wrong, if someone tried to make unauthorized changes to critical systems, these hidden protocols would activate automatically. And when that happened, only I would know how to deactivate them. I drove home from Axion for the last time on a gray Friday afternoon in March, watching the familiar landmarks of my daily commute fade in the rearview mirror. The coffee shop where I'd grabbed breakfast on rushed mornings. The parking garage where I'd spent countless hours. The office building where I'd invested 12 years of my life. It felt like the end of an era. But I wasn't sure what era was beginning. I spent the weekend in a kind of suspended animation, not sure how to structure my time without the familiar rhythms of work. I slept late on Saturday, something I hadn't done in years. I went for a long walk in Powell Butte Nature Preserve, something I'd always meant to do but never found time for. I called my sister Jenny and had a real conversation. Not just the brief check-ins that had become our standard interaction over the past few years. Jenny lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 young children. She worked part-time as a freelance graphic designer, which gave her flexibility to be involved in her kids' school activities and maintain friendships with other parents in the neighborhood. Her life seemed full in ways that mine had never been, rich with connections and experiences that extended beyond professional obligations. During our phone call, she asked what I was planning to do next. It was a reasonable question, but I realized I didn't have a good answer. I'd been so focused on work for so long that I'd never developed any other interests or goals. I had no hobbies to speak of, no social network outside of work, no clear sense of what I wanted to do with my life beyond maintaining computer systems. For 12 years, my identity had been defined by my role at Axion. I was the person who understood the systems, who could solve the problems, who could be counted on to work whatever hours were necessary to keep things running. Without that role, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. Jenny suggested that maybe this was an opportunity to figure that out. Maybe being forced out of a job that had consumed my entire life was actually a gift. A chance to discover what else I might be capable of. She pointed out that I was only 36 years old, that I had skills and experience that would be valuable to other companies, that I could take some time to think about what kind of work environment would actually make me happy. Her optimism was encouraging, but I wasn't ready to think about new opportunities yet. I was still processing the emotional impact of what had happened, still trying to understand how 12 years of dedicated service could be dismissed so casually. I needed time to grieve the loss of the professional identity that had defined me for so long before I could start building a new one. On Sunday evening, I was sitting on my couch with a glass of wine, half-heartedly browsing job listings on my laptop, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Logan Myers, one of the IT technicians at Axion. Logan and I had worked together on several major projects over the years, and he was one of the few people at the company who really understood the complexity of the systems I'd been managing. Logan sounded nervous when I answered the phone. He was calling from his personal cell phone, he said, because he didn't want the conversation to be logged on company systems. He had something he thought I should know about. Tracy had scheduled a major system update for the following Tuesday. She was planning to implement what she called an optimization protocol that would streamline database operations and improve system performance. The update was being promoted as a proactive measure to ensure that Axion's infrastructure could handle increased transaction volumes as the company continued to grow. The problem, Logan explained, was that no one in the IT department had been consulted about this optimization protocol. Tracy had apparently developed the plan based on her review of system documentation and her discussions with Charles about operational efficiency. She'd scheduled the update for Tuesday morning, just before Axion's biggest client presentation of the quarter. Logan had tried to ask Tracy about the technical details of the optimization, but she'd been evasive about specifics. She'd mentioned something about updating database indexes and streamlining authentication processes, but she hadn't provided the kind of detailed implementation plan that would normally be required for such a significant system change. More concerning, she'd requested administrative access to several systems that she'd never worked with before. When Logan had asked why she needed access to the legacy customer management system, she'd explained that the optimization would need to touch all database platforms to ensure consistency across the infrastructure. Logan was worried that Tracy was planning to make changes without fully understanding their potential impact. He'd seen what happened during the security update incident several months earlier, and he was concerned that something similar might occur on a much larger scale. He wanted to know if I had any insight into what Tracy might be planning, or if there was anything about Axion's systems that she should be aware of before attempting major modifications. I thanked Logan for calling and told him I'd think about what he'd said. But after I hung up, I sat staring at my phone for a long time. This was the moment I'd been anticipating without quite realizing it. Tracy was about to attempt exactly the kind of system modification that would trigger the hidden security protocols I'd built into Axion's infrastructure over the years. If she tried to make unauthorized changes to critical databases, especially the legacy customer management system, those security measures would activate automatically. The protocols were designed to detect what they would interpret as a potential security breach, someone with administrative access attempting to modify core systems in ways that deviated from established patterns. The authentication streamlining that Tracy was planning would certainly qualify as such a deviation, and the system would respond by locking down access to protect data integrity. Once those security measures activated, they would cascade through Axion's interconnected systems, essentially freezing all database operations until the perceived threat could be resolved. Email systems would lock down, customer records would become inaccessible. Financial reporting tools would shut down. The entire digital infrastructure that kept Axion running would effectively go into emergency mode. And only I knew how to deactivate those security protocols. I had a choice to make. I could call Logan back and warn him about the potential problems with Tracy's optimization plan. I could provide enough technical detail to help the IT team understand what might go wrong and how to prevent it. I could even offer to consult with Tracy directly, despite the fact that I no longer worked for the company, to ensure that her system changes were implemented safely. Or I could do nothing. I could let Tracy proceed with her optimization protocol and see what happened when it collided with the security architecture that I'd spent years building into Axion systems. The professional thing to do would be to help prevent a potential disaster. Even though I'd been treated poorly by the company, my former colleagues didn't deserve to suffer through a major system failure that could have been avoided. And the company's clients certainly didn't deserve to have their data compromised or their business disrupted because of internal political decisions. But there was another consideration that I couldn't ignore. For 12 years, I'd been taken for granted at Axion. My expertise had been undervalued, my contributions had been overlooked, and my warnings about system complexity had been dismissed by people who thought that technical knowledge could be easily transferred or replaced. Now those same people were about to discover exactly how much they'd depended on expertise they hadn't bothered to understand or appreciate. I thought about Charles's confidence that Tracy could handle my responsibilities. I thought about Tracy's belief that system administration was primarily a matter of following documented procedures. I thought about the assumption that 12 years of specialized knowledge could be transferred in a week of meetings. I thought about all the times I'd worked through weekends to fix problems that other people had created, all the family events I'd missed to handle system emergencies, all the stress and exhaustion and sacrifice that had been treated as just part of the job. Nothing special. Certainly nothing that couldn't be replaced by someone with better political skills and a more impressive resume. And I decided to do nothing. I didn't call Logan back. I didn't reach out to Tracy or Charles or anyone else at Axion. I turned off my phone and went to bed early. And I tried not to think about what would happen on Tuesday morning when Tracy implemented her optimization protocol. Monday passed quietly. I spent the day updating my resume and researching potential job opportunities, trying to focus on building a future rather than dwelling on the past. I went for another long walk, had lunch at a restaurant I'd never tried before, and called my parents to let them know about my employment situation. My mother was sympathetic but not entirely surprised. She'd been worried for years that I was working too much and sacrificing too much of my personal life for a job that didn't seem to appreciate what I was doing. My father, who'd spent 40 years working for the same utility company before retiring, was more philosophical about the situation. These things happen in the corporate world, he said. The important thing was to learn from the experience and make better choices going forward. Neither of them asked what I was planning to do next, which I appreciated because I still didn't have a good answer to that question. Tuesday morning, I woke up around 7 o'clock, my usual time for getting ready for work. For a moment, I lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the neighborhood coming to life. Cars starting, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Then I remembered that I didn't have anywhere to go, and I pulled the covers over my head and tried to go back to sleep. I couldn't. Around 8:30, I got up and made coffee and tried to distract myself with the morning news. But I kept thinking about what was happening at Axion. Tracy would be arriving at the office soon, if she wasn't there already. She'd be preparing for her system optimization, reviewing her notes, getting ready to implement the changes that she believed would improve operational efficiency. The client presentation was scheduled for 10 o'clock. It was a major opportunity for Axion, a chance to secure a contract with a Fortune 500 company that could significantly expand their business. Charles would be leading the presentation, with support from the sales team and technical demonstrations that would showcase Axion's capabilities. Everything depended on the systems working flawlessly. At 9:15, my phone started ringing. The first call was from Logan. I let it go to voicemail. The second call was from a number I didn't recognize, but which I suspected belonged to someone else from the IT department. The third call was from Charles. I turned off my phone. By 10 o'clock, the calls were coming continuously. Different numbers, but I could guess who they were from. The IT team trying to understand what was happening to their systems. Department managers trying to figure out why they couldn't access critical databases. Charles trying to maintain composure while his big presentation fell apart in real time. I made myself a second cup of coffee and sat on my balcony, looking out at the city where I'd lived and worked for more than a decade. Somewhere out there, in a glass office building 15 minutes away, the digital infrastructure of Axion Dynamics was shutting itself down, protecting itself from what it perceived as unauthorized access attempts. The irony wasn't lost on me. The security measures I'd built to protect the company were now protecting it from the company itself. Around 11 o'clock, I turned my phone back on to check the voicemails. There were 14 messages, and the tone progressed from confusion to concern to panic as the morning had developed. Logan's first message was technical, asking if I knew what might be causing widespread authentication failures across multiple systems. His second message, left an hour later, was more urgent. Madeline, I don't know if you can hear this, but we need help. Everything's locked down and we can't figure out why. Tracy's optimization crashed something major, and now nothing works. Please call me back. Charles's messages started formal and became increasingly desperate. The first one asked if I could provide some quick consultation on a technical issue they were experiencing. The second message, left 30 minutes later, dropped all pretense of corporate politeness. Madeline, we have a serious situation here. Our entire system is down and we can't access anything. The client presentation is postponed and we need to get this fixed immediately. I know you're no longer with the company, but we need your help. His third message, left just before I'd turned my phone back on, was barely controlled panic. Madeline, please call me back. I don't care what it takes. We need you here. Name your price. I deleted the voicemails without responding to any of them. Then I got dressed and drove to the mall. I spent the afternoon wandering through stores I'd never had time to visit when I was working 60-hour weeks. I bought new clothes that weren't selected based on their appropriateness for a conservative office environment. I had lunch at a restaurant with outdoor seating and watched people living their lives without the constant stress of system alerts and emergency fixes. It was strangely liberating to be completely disconnected from the crisis I knew was unfolding at Axion. For 12 years, every system problem had been my problem. Every technical emergency had required my immediate attention. Now, for the first time in over a decade, it was someone else's responsibility to figure out why the computers weren't working. I wondered how Tracy was handling her first major crisis as the person in charge of system operations. I wondered if she was beginning to understand the difference between reading documentation and actually managing complex technical infrastructure. I wondered if Charles was starting to reconsider his assessment of my replaceability, but mostly, I tried not to think about Axion at all. When I got home around 4 o'clock, my phone showed 37 missed calls and 22 new voicemails. I scrolled through the caller list and saw numbers I recognized from throughout the company. IT staff, department managers, even some people from the executive team whom I'd never spoken to directly during my entire tenure at Axion. The most recent call had come from a number I didn't recognize, but when I checked the voicemail, I heard a voice I definitely knew. Edith Monroe, the chairman of Axion's board of directors, had somehow gotten my personal phone number and was asking me to call her back as soon as possible. Edith Monroe was a legend in Portland's business community, a woman who'd built and sold 3 successful companies before joining Axion's board 2 years earlier. She was known for her direct communication style and her ability to cut through corporate bureaucracy to focus on practical solutions. If Edith Monroe was calling me personally, the situation at Axion was worse than I'd imagined. I made myself dinner and thought about whether to return her call. On one hand, I was curious about how bad things had gotten and what kind of offer they might be prepared to make to get my help. On the other hand, I was enjoying the feeling of being completely free from Axion's problems for the first time in 12 years. Finally, around 7 o'clock, I called Edith back. She answered on the first ring, which suggested she'd been waiting by her phone. Madeline Carter? Yes, this is Madeline. Thank God. This is Edith Monroe from Axion's board. I assume you know why I'm calling. I have a general idea. Then you know we're in serious trouble. Our entire system infrastructure has been down for 8 hours. We can't access customer data. We can't process orders. We can't even send emails. We've had to cancel 3 major client meetings and postpone our quarterly board presentation. Our IT team is completely lost. And Charles finally admitted that you're the only person who really understands how our systems work. I didn't respond immediately, so she continued. I'm going to be direct with you, Madeline. We made a mistake letting you go. Charles made a mistake, and I take responsibility for not overriding his decision when I should have. But right now, we need to focus on fixing this crisis before it destroys the company. What exactly do you want from me? We want you to come in and get our systems running again, and then we want to discuss bringing you back permanently, with a title and compensation package that reflects your actual value to this organization. What kind of title? Chief Information Officer. You'd report directly to me and the board, not to Charles. You'd have full authority over all technology decisions and a staff budget to build the kind of IT department we should have had years ago. It was an impressive offer, the kind of recognition I'd wanted for years, but I wasn't ready to accept it immediately. What makes you think I can fix your current problem? Because Charles finally admitted that most of our systems were custom built by you over the years, and that the documentation doesn't include everything someone would need to know to maintain them properly. He also admitted that Tracy's optimization probably triggered some kind of security protocol that nobody else knows about. I smiled, despite myself. Charles had figured out more than I'd expected. Even if I could fix your systems, why would I want to come back to work for a company that eliminated my position just a week ago? Because we're offering you the job you should have had all along, with the authority and resources you need to do it properly. And because you built something important at Axion, something that took years to create and can't be easily replaced, you have a right to see it treated with the respect it deserves. She paused, then added, also because if we can't get our systems running by tomorrow morning, we're going to lose clients that took years to acquire. And if we lose those clients, we'll have to lay off about 30% of our workforce. That was the argument that got to me. Whatever I thought about Charles and Tracy and the company's management decisions, there were a lot of good people at Axion who didn't deserve to lose their jobs because of other people's mistakes. I want to see a written offer before I agree to anything, I said. I can have something drafted tonight. When can you come in? I looked at the clock on my kitchen wall. It was 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, and I was sitting in my pajamas in my quiet apartment, completely free from the stress and responsibility that had defined my life for 12 years. I'll be there in an hour, I said. The drive back to Axion felt surreal, like returning to a place I'd lived in a previous life. The building looked the same, but everything felt different now that I was returning on my own terms rather than as an expendable employee who could be eliminated whenever it became convenient. The parking garage was fuller than usual for a Tuesday evening. Emergency situations tend to bring out the worst in corporate hierarchies, and I suspected that every manager in the building was trying to demonstrate their commitment to solving the crisis by staying late and looking busy. I rode the elevator to the 15th floor and found the operations department in controlled chaos. Workstations were surrounded by multiple people, all offering suggestions about what might be wrong and what should be tried next. The usually quiet hum of normal business activity had been replaced by the frantic energy of people who were in over their heads and running out of options. Logan spotted me first and rushed over with obvious relief. Thank God you're here. We've been trying everything we can think of, but nothing's working. Show me what's happening. He led me to the main system administration console, where Tracy was sitting with a stack of printouts and a laptop covered in sticky notes. She looked up when she saw me approaching, and her expression was a mixture of embarrassment and desperation. Madeline, I'm so glad you're here. I think I may have caused some kind of cascading failure, but I can't figure out how to reverse it. I looked at the monitor, which was showing a series of error messages that I recognized immediately. The hidden security protocols had activated exactly as designed, detecting Tracy's optimization attempts as unauthorized system modifications and implementing protective lockdown procedures. Walk me through exactly what you did this morning, I said. Tracy consulted her notes and began describing her optimization process. She'd started by attempting to update database indexes across multiple platforms, using scripts that she'd found in the system documentation. When those updates had proceeded more slowly than expected, she'd tried to accelerate the process by running multiple optimization routines simultaneously. The breaking point had come when she'd attempted to streamline authentication protocols for the customer management system. She'd noticed that the system was using what appeared to be redundant security checks, so she'd tried to eliminate what she thought were unnecessary steps to improve performance. Those unnecessary security checks were actually part of the hidden authentication system I'd built to protect against exactly this kind of modification. When Tracy had tried to bypass them, the system had interpreted her actions as a potential security breach and had activated emergency protection protocols. The lockdown was comprehensive and automatic. Every database that interfaced with the customer management system had been frozen to prevent data corruption. Authentication servers had switched to emergency mode, rejecting all access attempts until the perceived threat could be resolved. Even email servers had been affected, since they used the same authentication infrastructure as other company systems. Tracy had spent the day trying to reverse her changes, but she didn't understand the underlying architecture well enough to identify which modifications had triggered the lockdown. Every attempt to regain access had been interpreted by the security system as continued evidence of unauthorized activity, causing the protective measures to become even more restrictive. "So can you fix it?" Tracy asked. I nodded. "But it's going to take some time. These security measures were designed to be difficult to override, even for someone who knows how they work." That wasn't entirely true. I could have the systems running again in about 20 minutes if I wanted to. But I was enjoying the feeling of being essential rather than expendable, and I wanted to make sure that everyone understood exactly how much they'd taken for granted over the years. I spent the next 2 hours slowly and methodically working through the process of deactivating the security protocols. I explained each step to Logan and Tracy as I went, partly to help them understand what had gone wrong, and partly to demonstrate the complexity of the systems they thought could be easily managed by anyone with administrative access. The customer management system came back online first, followed by the authentication servers and then the various databases that interfaced with them. As each system was restored, I could hear sighs of relief from around the office. Email started working again. Customer records became accessible. The digital infrastructure that kept Axion running slowly came back to life. By 10 o'clock, everything was functioning normally again. But the crisis had revealed some uncomfortable truths about the company's technical vulnerabilities and the risks of assuming that complex systems could be managed without deep expertise. Charles appeared as I was finishing the restoration process. He looked exhausted and considerably more humble than he had during our last conversation. "Madeline, I owe you an apology. And probably a lot more than that. You owe me a written job offer," I said. "Edith and I discussed the terms over the phone. Whatever you want, we'll make this right." I looked around the office at the colleagues who'd spent the day struggling with problems they didn't know how to solve. Good people who'd been caught in the middle of management decisions that prioritize politics over competence. "I want a real IT department," I said, "with proper staffing and realistic budgets and management that understands the difference between technical expertise and administrative oversight." "Done." "And I want Tracy to be reassigned to something that better matches her actual skills. She's good with people and processes, but she shouldn't be managing technical systems." Tracy nodded emphatically. After 8 hours of dealing with cascading system failures, she seemed more than ready to return to work that didn't require understanding database architecture. "Also done," Charles said. I gathered my things and prepared to leave. I'll see you tomorrow morning to discuss the details. And Charles, next time you think about eliminating a position to save money, make sure you understand what that position actually does first. As I walked back to the elevator, I could hear normal office sounds returning for the first time in 8 hours. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the quiet hum of systems doing what they were designed to do. I'd spent 12 years building the digital infrastructure that kept Axion Dynamics running. And in one day, I'd proven exactly how essential that work really was. More importantly, I'd proven it to myself. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I rode down to the parking garage with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of being valued for what I could actually do, rather than dismissed for what I couldn't or wouldn't pretend to be. Tomorrow, I'd return to Axion Dynamics as Chief Information Officer, with the authority and resources I needed to build something even better than what I'd created before. But tonight, I was going home to my quiet apartment, where I could sit on my balcony with a glass of wine and think about the future I was finally free to create. For the first time in 12 years, I was looking forward to going to work. The next morning, I arrived at Axion at 9 o'clock sharp, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I had a meeting scheduled with Edith Monroe and the board of directors to formalize my new position. And then I had a company to rebuild. As I walked through the lobby of the glass tower that had been my professional home for so long, I realized that everything looked exactly the same as it had a week earlier. The same corporate artwork on the walls, the same security desk, the same elevator bank leading to the upper floors. But everything had changed, because I had changed. I was no longer the invisible technician who kept things running from behind the scenes. I was the person who controlled the systems that everyone else depended on. And for the first time in my career, everyone knew it. The elevator carried me up to the 15th floor, where I could see through the glass walls that the operations department was humming with normal activity again. Phones were ringing, computers were working, and people were going about their business with the confidence that comes from knowing the infrastructure will support whatever they need to do. I'd built that infrastructure, and now I was going to make it even better. As the elevator doors opened and I stepped into my new role as Chief Information Officer of Axion Dynamics, I couldn't help but smile. It had taken 12 years and one catastrophic system failure, but I'd finally found my place at the table, and this time, no one was going to take it away from me.